This is, of course, the first year we've done this in indoors, and the first year in Mason Square, Arlington campus. And there's a reason for that, which is next door is a new building rising. It's called Fuse. And it's during COVID, Richmond put basically $250 million into Mason to develop a College of Engineering and Computing and an increased technical presence here in Arlington. Before, this had been largely the law school, the policy and governance school, conflict resolution. And it's part of a conscious plan, if you will, to look at what makes Silicon Valley succeed, which is basically world-class academics coupled with innovative business, coupled with alumni networks, and say, okay, here we have world-class business, we have alumni, we're building world-class academics now, but it's also got proximity to government, which Silicon Valley can't match. And so Fuse is going to be a remarkable building that's going to have, every floor will have business and government and academia mixed together on the floor. So this is the beginning. So we're doing this here in part to position ourselves for future years when we'll be wrapped up in that. So let me give me enormous pleasure to introduce our keynote this morning, Sherri Goodman, who has an extraordinary resume. It's in the program, but national security executive, public policy on boards, lawyer, and she's the author of a new is it forthcoming still? When do you expect it out?
Late August.
Late August. Okay. Threat Multiplier: Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. She was also the Deputy Undersecretary for Environmental Security back in the Clinton administration. So, but today, what I'm really, really excited about is she's going to take our theme of adapting to climate change and apply this to the work she's done. So the theme, as you can say, is threat multiplier, climate security, and sustainable resilience, how you turn this into opportunities rather than just threats. Sherri? Welcome. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. Perfect. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Well, you're a small but mighty crowd all here at 9 o'clock to hear this talk. And I want to first thank Linton. I have really been privileged to work with him for so many years. At the Pentagon, we were colleagues together, and Linton was an early pioneer of integrating technology into defense policy in all that he's done. And I really congratulate you, Linton, for the 17th year now of Star Tides. I remember coming in the very early years outside at NDU, and that was really just terrific. And I see friends and colleagues here in the audience. Many of you have been with me on this journey. This story I'm going to tell you this morning. Oh, let's see. Did we talk about how I move the slides? Is this the right one? Someone tell me, is this my clicker here? And we'll just see. Point it, okay. There we go. Okay, that's it. So I'm going to tell you the story about climate and national security, which actually is really deeply connected in this place, as we'll see in just a minute. As Linton said, this is a place right here in Northern Virginia that's got this unique convergence of security, public policy, and tech. So the story here is about the convergence of environment, climate, and national security over definitely my lifetime. Not maybe, some of you younger folks don't see yourself all the way back, before the Cold War. But if you look at this slide, you see on the top that we have the major events of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact, a Strategic Defense Initiative, 9/11, but we also have on the bottom some of the major environmental milestones of our era, starting from the creation of the National Environmental Policy Act and the Environmental Protection Agency, the Montreal Protocol, starting all the climate era with the creation of the International Panel on Climate Change, and then leading into an era where climate and security are actually deeply connected. And that story really starts, and this is going to be the overview of what we'll talk about this morning, really starts right here in Northern Virginia at the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA, which is now right down the road. Rich remembers it, Linton. We were in Alexandria when we started this work, but then I moved. I was there for 15 years. After my 8 years at the Department of Defense, after 2001, I joined the Center for Naval Analysis, and in 2007, I organized the first group of generals and admirals to examine the national security implications of climate change. Good morning. And I spent a year with them. We learned from the world's leading climate scientists like Jim Hansen and others about climate science, and industry leaders. We went to the UK Met Office in London and met with other foreign leaders. And the war fighters, the generals and admirals, 3 and 4 stars, former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, head of Pacific Command, Central Command, many others, head of our nuclear Navy, applied their warfighting sensibilities and analysis to address the national security implications of climate change. And we said back in 2007 that we called it projected climate change at the time. Now you wouldn't have to put projected in front of it, but it poses a serious threat to America's national security. And that's where we coined the phrase threat multiplier. I coined that phrase to characterize how climate change interacts and causes instability in fragile regions of the world. Now we know that occurs even in stable regions like our own. We see the instability from climate change, and that will add to tensions. And then the important point, in fact, Rich Kozulek and I were just talking about this coming in here, is that underscored the interconnectedness of climate, national security, and energy. You can't solve for climate you can't have a secure climate without understanding the energy implications. And you really can't be secure in your energy supply without understanding the climate implications. They have to be connected. Now, the facts of energy have actually changed in the almost 2 decades since we first wrote this report. When we first wrote it, it was all about reducing America's dependence on foreign sources of energy. Now, of course, America is an energy superpower of its own, so energy security has a different meaning today, and it has different meanings in different parts of the world. Okay. The Center for Naval Analysis, CNA, we've done about 8 different reports on climate, mostly on energy, different aspects of energy, powering America's defense energy, electrifying energy, various forms of critical minerals, and also water and water stress. Okay. This is probably a little bit of 101 for most of you. What are the threat multipliers? Heat that has been increasing now on average. We've well exceeded, or just about exceeded, the 1.5 degree target of Paris. Parts of the planet are close to 3 or even 4 degrees above baseline temperatures. We have prolonged drought, fires, sea level rise, occurring across the globe, affecting particularly major cities around the world, flooding, and storms. Okay, this is how the climate and security risks sort of interact. So you've got, on one side, the climate trends or threat multipliers, the physical impacts of climate. But then it's not just those physical impacts, because it has to interact with other factors. So you see on the right, poverty and socioeconomic inequalities, fragile states, poor governance, violent extremism, which has been on the rise in many parts of the world, and then the whole demographics, population, human displacements, all mutually reinforcing, and they interact together and they exacerbate risks of conflict and instability. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some geopolitical risks, and I'm going to put this in the context of the military and our national security apparatus. It could be, we could zoom out even more and do it as a broader foreign policy, but because we're here, and I'm going to put it in the context of how our military thinks about it. So this is from the Department of Defense Climate Risk Analysis of a couple of years ago. This is I've kind of stepped us forward a little bit from work that's been done. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Over the last 15 years to work that's really accelerated under this administration to integrate climate risk analysis into military operational planning. So this was an effort to look at how climate risks affect each of our major combatant commands and what they need to do. Today, they're doing a lot more wargaming around all of this with some very interesting implications. It helps us better understand both the near-term risks and some of the longer-term trends which we have to integrate into our force planning and into our acquisition. Okay, so how does DoD think about it? The security implications of climate risks. You've got climate hazards, let's say more drought, more flooding, and then you've got the impacts, let's say reduced water supply, or you're going to have critical assets inundated, and that's going to have competition for scarce natural resources or increased demand for the military to deploy to support civilian authorities. We see that both here at home in response to natural disasters, flooding, everything from Hurricane Sandy on forward to today, as well as the overseas support for natural disaster and humanitarian assistance in what we call HADR. And then the secondary impact, which has become really pronounced and apparent really since the Ukraine war, which is agricultural production being reduced, and that affecting global food supplies, also infrastructure damage, and that compounds with drought in certain regions and adds to heightened tension and likelihood of migration. Okay, now I'm going to just do a couple of regions of the world. I won't do every region this year, but you can read my book later, and I do cover all the regions of the world. I'm going to go from here to the Norwegian embassy this morning to talk about Arctic security, which includes climate and national security. So the Arctic is an area where temperatures have been rising almost 4 degrees higher than baseline average. And you can see now the temperature extremes, particularly on the Russian side of the Arctic. That's where you see the red. There's both sea ice retreat, rising temperatures, permafrost thaw and collapse. Okay, I guess this isn't rotating. The ice melt, slide with the blue, you could, if it were actually activated, you'd see it shrink from that 1950 into a very small number, much smaller area. And then the permafrost thaw and collapse, which is affecting infrastructure across the Arctic with potentially serious ecological consequences as well as methane release from thawing permafrost, much of which is not captured in global climate models. So one of the one Arctic problem that I am working on today is how better to understand and monitor and model Arctic methane releases, because that's going to be very important to basically understanding how methane, which is a super climate pollutant, affects our ability to reach our climate goals. Okay, so the Arctic, when I was working with Linton and others in the Department of Defense in the 1990s, was an area where we were actually cooperating with the Russians to reduce their nuclear weapons. We were denuclearizing Russia after the Cold War. I had a particular program called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, where we helped the Russians safely offload liquid waste streams from decommissioned and sunken Russian submarines that were in Murmansk, close to the Norwegian border, and Norway was very concerned that releases from these sunken nuclear submarines might contaminate their prized fishing grounds and harm their economy. So we ran a whole program for about a decade, working with the Russians, basically helping them build a cask safely to offload those liquid waste streams for safer on-land storage. Now, that era of cooperation has changed, of course, with Putin now in many incursions across Europe from Crimea now to Ukraine, with his ambition to create a toll road for transit across the northern sea route, Russia's long Arctic coastline, that will serve as a toll road for transit from Asia, from Shanghai, all the way across to Rotterdam and other ports in between. And as you can see here, you've got the various Arctic sea routes. You've got the northern sea route in blue. You've got, in brown along Canada, the Northwest Passage, which is much more shallow, much more complicated, and less navigable. And then potentially in the future, a central polar route opening because of climate change. Now much of that area is governed by a Central Arctic Fisheries Moratorium that the US, China, Russia, and many other countries have signed, but it expires in about, 16 years from 2016, I think. So it expires in the 2030s. And during that time, China, which has its own Arctic ambitions, has the opportunity to do research and observation in the Central Arctic region. And with its ambition to be a near-Arctic stakeholder and an Arctic power, I sometimes think that their future prize in this region is the fish, because as global fish stocks decline, migrate to different waters with rising temperatures, ocean acidification, and the other impacts of climate change. And then, oh, by the way, China's one of the major illegal fishers around the world. It's got illegal, unreported fishing, IOU fishing, and these fish stocks are migrating to both poles, that this is going to be one of the next major areas of strategic competition. Okay, so new contested region. The Department of Defense is actually about to release its new updated Arctic strategy, so I expect you'll hear a lot more about this in the near future. Okay, now I'm going to, and I apologize that this slide is a little complicated, but I wanted to give you an idea of what the Department of Defense is actually doing today to, what I say, close the gap between improving prediction capability for climate as it applies to defense decision-making in our combatant commands. Because the challenge has been for a while that you get the four-star in there at the, and he says, oh yeah, she, or even she, it's General Laura Richardson in Southcom, and she says, yes, I see that we have a lot of, we're responding more often to natural disasters and floods. And I understand the climate impacts. They're very real in my region. But how do I actually do better planning around it? Because militaries are essentially a planning organization. So this is work that's being done by, it's actually a DoD-funded activity. It's called the Global Water Security Center. It's set in Huntsville, Alabama. Anybody guess why this activity is in Huntsville, Alabama? Well, why is space in Huntsville, Alabama? Okay, Senator Shelby and the very powerful Alabama congressional delegation. Anyway, and that's why it's called the Global Water Security Center, but it really is doing water and climate prediction. And so this map is obviously an unclassified map, and it gives you very tactical level detail about how drought, heat, flooding, other impacts of climate are going to affect various parts of the region. And that allows for more tailored planning at the operational level, and it allows for further engagement with our allies and partners in the region. So this, I would say, is the beginning of much more sophisticated climate prediction, climate intelligence, if you will, that allows us to ingest climate, it's part of resilience building, climate effects into planning. Okay, and this is sort of another view of it. This one gets very detailed onto historically heavy rain that's expected to occur next month in this region, and what the impacts are going to be. So this, I think, is the beginning, as I said, and it also talks about how areas become less resilient after experiencing multiple climate shocks. So it's not just that you're going to have a heavy downpour, heavy rain at one time, but that might be coming on top of a prolonged drought, which has left the soil more likely to not be able to absorb that water. And that can then lead to fires, debris flow, landslides, other devastating impacts, both for people and for infrastructure. Okay, now I'm going to move from kind of threat multiplier to opportunity multiplier, which is also how my book ends and what the focus of your work is here, which is leading by example and technologies and sustainability solutions. So first, to frame it a little bit, the Department of Defense, in their climate adaptation plan, has these 5 pillars for a way to look at and sort of execute their climate adaptation strategy. And probably your exhibits today, which unfortunately I probably won't have enough time to see, really address maybe different aspects of this, whether it's climate-informed decision-making. And in fact, today we have a whole Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Readiness Cone, Linton, who is Caroline Baxter is her name, and she has created this whole program about climate education and decision-making in defense as a readiness activity. That's really a remarkable statement of how far the Department of Defense has come in thinking about this. And that also connects to how to train and equip a climate-ready workforce. For example, one of the something that will be, I'll preview a little bit, the Arctic strategy that's coming out is we need to be better trained to operate in the Arctic. And we have let atrophy since the end of the Cold War some of the gear and equipment that our land forces, our Army and our Marines would need to operate in that region. Okay. Then we need resilience of built and natural infrastructure, particularly as our military bases, like small cities, are hard hit by climate impacts, supply chain resilience and innovation, and then, of course, collaboration here in the U.S. and with our allies and partners. Now, this, again, is a little bit complicated, but I think this is part of, I'm going to go back to this improving predictive capability. This is how DoD is thinking about integrating climate into decisions over time and the weather to climate continuum. The basic message of this slide is that while we have reliable weather prediction out today about 1 to close to 2 weeks, which is a lot better than when I was younger. It was only a few days. Now it's out past a week. Fairly reliable weather prediction. Climate really starts at the global scale, global climate models, which are now being downscaled to be applied at a regional and even local level. But you need that fidelity at the local level to be able to have good decision-making of the types that the Department of Defense does, everything from military operations to war gaming to infrastructure planning and weapon system acquisition. And so these are the types of decisions, for example, that the Department of Defense is trying to put climate into. Everything from amphibious assaults, exercise planning, budget planning, war games, and infrastructure. And those are kind of all the stakeholders, who's doing what, and there you go. So another very large area of focus for resilience and opportunity is our installations and infrastructure, because they have been hard hit by hurricanes, severe weather events. You can see there the hangars torn off at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida by Hurricane Michael a few years ago, loss of access to training areas from fire, coastal erosion, particularly in Alaska, but other parts of the U.S. as well, flash floods, and of course, sea level rise. And here you see more about the hurricanes that damaged both Tyndall and Camp Lejeune. And now there's an opportunity to build, I'm just using Tyndall as an example, but there are other bases here that are trying to become the resilient base of the future. And they're trying to do this by both restoring the hangars, rebuilding the hangars to a higher wind standard, because they weren't built to withstand the winds of Hurricane Michael, but also looking very much at the natural infrastructure, what we do along the shoreline, so that it is better able to withstand more extreme weather events. So this is one example. There are many more, and this is sort of important as a standard here. Now let's talk a little bit about DoD energy use. The Department of Defense is the single largest energy user in the federal government. Most of it goes to what we call operational energy, and most of that is used by the Air Force, because that powers our aircraft, our bombers, our fighters, and the like. And then you can see the approximate distribution there. Now, the Department of Defense has a very ambitious goal to transition to net zero in electricity by 2035 and fully by 2050. Here are some of the ways it's looking at doing it, both through vehicle electrification and charging stations. Very ambitious microgrids at most of our major bases, which allow us not only to be climate smart, but also to be energy secure from a grid attack or a power outage, as well as putting on more renewables and also small modular reactors, nuclear reactors. There's a lot of growth and opportunity in new nuclear that's being examined, geothermal energy, and there are other opportunities as well. Here's one that I think is very interesting, a very interesting opportunity. It's not only about in being climate smart and climate resilient. It's not only about the transition to new, cleaner energy sources. It's about making our weapon system more efficient. So this is called the blended wing body aircraft, a new design for an aircraft that would give you about 30% efficiency over current fighter aircraft to reduce fuel demand and increase global reach. So what's important here is that for so many years, until really about the last almost decade, the view about how you get more lethal weapon systems and how you get better improvement in performance of your weapon systems always required greater fuel. Like every time we built a new generation tank, it required more fuel, more gas. Everything was gas guzzling, okay? Now, only in the last decade have we really broken that Gordian knot and realized that we can get actually improved military effectiveness and improved performance, often at lower fuel use. Okay, here's an example of going net zero. The Marine Corps Base Albany is the first DoD electrically net zero installation. They've got microgrid, they've got geothermal, they've got waste-to-energy plants. They work very closely with their community, with their utility. It was a multi-year process, but I think you'll see many more bases going net zero. Maybe some of the technologies and innovations you're working on here will be picked up by some of our military bases in the future. Here's one more example, floating solar at Fort Liberty, which used to be called Fort Bragg. It's a floating solar PV system, and it supports mission readiness through continuous power supply. So it's both climate smart, but it's also improving energy security and mission readiness. Okay, I'm going to sort of close up here now by talking a little bit about our allies and partners. NATO has also been very forward-leaning on this subject under Secretary General Stoltenberg, who was Norway's climate ambassador some years ago before becoming Secretary General. NATO has had very ambitious climate and security policies, really looking not at both decarbonizing our energy systems and increasing interoperability as we move towards new forms of energy. This was at the NATO summit last year in Vilnius. I spoke there. I spoke at the prior summit in Madrid the year before, and the summit this year will be in Washington. So hopefully there will be a comparable attention there on these issues. And this is an example of a NATO study on Norfolk, which is also a NATO, it's not only, a major Navy base, Air Force base, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, Army. Well, we also have a NATO command headquarters there. NATO did a study last year looking at sea level rise impacts at Norfolk, Virginia, and how to improve resilience there. We did a report through an organization I co-lead with the former Dutch Chief of Defense called the International Military Council on Climate and Security. We put out this report on how to decarbonize defense, and maybe some of you will take a look at that and see some innovations that you might be able to operationalize through your own sustainability technologies here at George Mason. So I will end by sharing my book cover with you. That's the book, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. It will be out in late August. And, I see my friend, my Italian friend that I met, Maurizio, when I spoke at the NATO Center for Maritime Research and Experimentation last fall about climate and maritime security, which is a whole nother extremely important subject. And I'm very glad that team there is really leading in doing sort of comparable things to what you all are doing here, sort of applying sustainability technology to come up with better innovations at the local level there. They're looking at NATO's maritime. It's a huge maritime hub for NATO there on the Italian coast. And so all of these innovative efforts need to be linked together, and that moves us from the threat multiplier to the opportunity multiplier that will leave us, hopefully, a better future for all of you and for my children, and hopefully someday my grandchildren, too. So with that, I will thank you for joining me this morning, and Linton will tell us if we want to take some questions.
Thanks, George. Okay. And if you use the microphone, please, so we just get the taping. Let me start with one question then, and that's what can we in academia do to help this process along? What are some of the major contributions of holes unfilled by, say, the public policy debate that we can contribute to?
Well, to summarize, what I think that you can, the analysis, for example, that many of you have done. I followed Rich Kouserlick's work over many years, connecting better the climate and energy geopolitics as they apply to the evolving changes in energy flows around the world is extremely important. That's sort of at a geopolitical level. But there are also a lot of important opportunities more at the operational level to look at how to really ingest sustainability and resilience into defense decision-making, and whether that's in improving our predictive capability, kind of closing the gap between weather and climate, or it's at the, at affecting both our installations, our troops, as well as our improved training and exercising, connecting all these dots and connecting in at the community level. And then there are technology innovations. And, sometimes it takes a lot of door knocking to have those be brought to the attention of defense decision makers. And I think that's one of the things you've been successful at, Linton, is making those innovations coming out of academia and the technology community around here available to those to defense decision makers.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. Wonderful, comprehensive presentation. Rich Dooley with Arlington County. This question is installation-based, and your mention of installation and community and bridging those two areas. You had mentioned microgrids. Can you point to examples where DoD has created microgrids on base and then tied them to help to serve either critical assets or just the community in general outside of the installation's boundaries? Thank you.
I believe that's the case in Albany, Georgia, that the microgrid also provides and supports services off the base. Don't quote me on that. You'd have to go back and look at that. But, these things all, military bases are not islands. They might be islands of nature in some places where they have become home to endangered species and fragile ecosystems in many parts of the country, but they're not islanded energy and water-wise. The infrastructure really, as you know, deeply connects, and the military is dependent. First of all, many military families live off base, and the military is part of the community. So one of the areas there are already legislative provisions that have been growing over the decades to increase the ability of the Department of Defense to make its resilience improvements available off base. For example, one of the longstanding provisions that we worked on was something called defense access roads, that DoD could actually invest in improving roads off base that allowed military personnel to get on base. For example, in Norfolk, you have sunny day flooding now because of sea level rise, storm surge, and the subsidence in that region. And sometimes the roads are flooded and the military can't get from where they live off base on base. So defense access roads investments now allows for some of that. There's oftentimes you have to get into the eaches and examine where the holes and the gaps in authorities are and push on it a little bit. And, I'm fortunate to work with, at the Center for Climate and Security Council on Strategic Risks, a retired Army general who also affiliates with the Nature Conservancy and also works every year closely to examine where there are additional gaps that can be closed through new legislative or other action in this area. So, good question. Yes.
Hi, Mike McDonald, Resilient American Communities. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share some scenarios with us, unclassified scenarios, because what we're trying to figure out is what do we do with sender communities and receiver communities? And given the scenarios that we're looking at in terms of polycrisis, the sender communities and receiver communities are very different. The world is not going to look most likely like it does today, even 10 years from now, potentially for many of the American communities. And 20 to 30 years from now, perhaps significantly different. Many places will not be livable, and other places will be more livable within the United States. So there'll be most likely mass migrations, and in talking with HUD and FEMA and other federal agencies, they really do not have a paradigm for receiver communities yet. The DoD seems to be closer to that with Red Horse and other approaches to rapidly assembling communities, cities that can receive very large populations, but I'm not seeing it happen in some places yet. So if you could give us a sense of scenarios and how we as a society and as a government need to think about organizing ourselves for this, these future scenarios.
Great big question. Okay. In this area, there really are, there's two types of climate scenarios you might think of if you're, when you're in the Department of Defense, for example. They're the kind that our combatant commands are using to war game how climate impacts, let's say, in Africa or South America or Indo-PACOM are going to affect the region and affect the military's ability to respond under various conditions. And although I don't think that's what you're talking about, there's thinking about how our infrastructure is going to be affected, military base infrastructure, going to be affected by climate trends in coming decades, and especially when we don't have an active base closure authority that allows us to easily make changes. When I was in the Department of Defense, we were executing the base closure law, which from 88 through 95 had 4 rounds of closing bases, and that allows us to right-size the infrastructure of the military after the Cold War. Now you could say we should be right-sizing for climate and other impacts, which we don't have authority to do so. In my book, I talk about, and others, in the Department of Defense have thought about different ways, different types of categories in which to think about how climate is going to affect military bases, which could be, you could apply this at the local level too. Of course, some of these decisions are very decentralized in the United States, so it relies on local planning. You may have some places where it's just not going to be suitable to continue to have the same kind of community. You have places in Alaska and in Gulf Coast Louisiana, you have small communities that have already relocated because of climate risk. Newtok, Alaska, moved 9 miles upriver because of coastal erosion and flooding. Ile St. Charles, I think it is, Louisiana, also has at least partly relocated. And there will be probably other coastal communities that will be among the first to relocate. But then you have other, parts of the U.S. If you take Miami, people often talk about this. Why are people still building these big high-rises in Miami when we all know that it's very vulnerable to extreme weather events and sea level rise and coastal erosion? And okay, we're also boiling the ocean down there at some times of the year. People have, what I've concluded is that people have different risk tolerance profiles, and then people also have different financial profiles. So where you see, someone has maybe a lot of money, but a short-term, profile, they're like, well, if I can build this thing here and I can enjoy it for X number of years, and I'm not maybe caring about what the future is going to bring. But city and local planners should have a longer time horizon. But how those risk management decisions are made in different locations, it really becomes very, as I said, it's a very local decision. If you think about the Department of Defense, you could see the Department of Defense potentially relocating, let's say, some major, relocating like office space, administrative space, headquarters, places where you don't do as much training, out into safer areas. Like we have some major commands in Tampa, Florida, right? Do they have to be there? Could they be somewhere else? That's a different type of decision than the one that was made at Tyndall Air Force Base, which has an F-35 squadron and trains over special use airspace in the Gulf. How easy is it to move that? Because it's hard to get new training ranges, new airspace, for example. Then you've got Fort Stewart in Georgia, where we do tank training, but it's rapidly becoming swamp. Okay, people have thought about, well, maybe in the future it won't be, you won't have an armored brigade there, but you could do light infantry training because it could be better able to accommodate a new mission. So you could potentially swap out missions. That's to say, in a community, would you change how the community is used? Could it be used more for coastal enjoyment, but not have as many big high rises on it? those are options. And in other places, you're just going to harden the infrastructure because it's so important. Like New York City is not likely to relocate. And the fact that it's vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge means that it's got to harden its infrastructure to future likely impacts. It got, after Superstorm Sandy, it got an injection of billions of dollars to improve it, probably not enough to withstand all future events, but to be a little bit ahead of where it would have been otherwise. And, you can see the same thing if you look at like Langley Air Force Base down, Joint Base Langley Eustis down here in Virginia. Part of its mission is to defend the Capitol, and it's got a fighter squadron there. So, that mission likely cannot be relocated. That's why you would harden the base and ensure that those runways can continue to operate. Okay, sir.
Thank you, Sherri, for being here. I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet, the Emerald Planet TV.
Oh, yes,
And
good to see you.
good to see you. Looking at the map, the world, in a sense, is drying out. We now have over 90 million people that are refugees, mostly from climate. You have another 60 million internally displaced people around the world, particularly on the African continent, some in Latin America and other places. So the military is saying the greatest destabilizer and threat that we have is climate change. And this is something I heard over 10 years ago, and it's just accelerating. So what do we need to be doing that allows us to develop in local communities? And there's a number of people in this room outside of the military that are looking at the humanitarian and the social and local community development impacts. So how do we address that and also involve the military in that decision-making process? Because it's facing, when you go to the Horn of Africa, there's, tens of millions of people that are displaced. What do you do with them? And many of them are becoming more and more bad actors because they have nothing else. Same thing in the Middle East. Bangladesh, 50 million people probably have to be located out of the Delta and go somewhere because that's sea level rise and, the hurricanes and typhoons is taking over. So anyway, what do we need to do to, integrate all of this so we're actually planning now to harden assets just like we had to do some in Alaska, but other places as well?
Right, no, it's a
And thank
great
you for being
question.
here.
It's a great question, and it connects with a study I just completed for the Department of State. I'm the vice chair of something called the Secretary's International Security Advisory Board, and we just did a study on new security challenges that I led, which was about integrating climate, resource scarcity, infectious disease, gender, and identity across our foreign policy decision-making, foreign policy in the State Department. And that goes to integrating climate into security assistance and security cooperation, essentially. We have a set of authorities in state defense on security assistance, security cooperation. They typically have not included these dimensions. That's what needs to happen. Thank you.
Last two questions.
Maybe we'll take them both, and then I'll just answer.
Okay, quick one. Thanks very much for being here. So I'm an adjunct teacher. I teach high school students ecology and environment.
Yes, it's great.
And our mantra is everything is everywhere connected. So one of the things, everything you've talked about, we're discussing with high school kids, and it's revelation. So the question, we talk a lot about the circular economy and designing products from the beginning that can be reused. I've spent a career cleaning up hazardous waste sites of the military and DOE and so on. So I'm bringing 6 students down for a tour of the Pentagon that are high school students.
Great.
And I want, and what they haven't understood is how much the military actually does to advance environmental tech and cleanup. So is there a specific function these days in the apparatus, let's say, an office of circular economy, in other words, working with materials from the design phase to have less waste?
Okay, thank you. And I'll take your question too.
Okay, I wanted to ask your thoughts on 2 kind of moonshot technologies. So the first is single-cell protein. this notion of basically doing large-scale food synthesis in bioreactors as a way of easing up some of the problems that will be caused by agricultural collapse. I know there's a bunch of work in the commercial sector. I'm wondering about that as a kind of defense, logistics, DARPA type project. Thing one. Thing two, similarly, US has an almost infinite number of bases around the world. What do you think of the possibility of putting modular reactors on those bases to sell electricity into local power grids so that we could spread nuclear technology without the associated nuclear proliferation risk and maintenance problems with kind of leaky old reactors and this kind of stuff?
Okay. Great. Okay. To your question, my former office in the Department of Defense, which is now called the Assistant Secretary of Defense for, I think, Energy Installations and Environment, EIE, some combination of those three words. They're the ones who really focus on the infrastructure and circular economy. There are people in there. If you're going to the Pentagon with your students and you see the exhibits, Brendan Owens is the name of the Assistant Secretary there now. Mike McGee, who is an Air Force retired SES, is the head of climate resilience in that office. He's really good. He's been doing this since he was a young Air Force civil engineer, and we worked together. Mike McGee, and he's great. And so, yeah, I would, if you get your students in front of him or some of the others at that exhibit, I think their eyes will be opened and they will learn a lot. I'm not sure I can answer your first question very well about the ag, although I do know that, increasingly Department of Defense, because of its experience with the Army Corps of Engineers in terms of, doing regenerative agriculture, even, in places around the world, is very aware of advances in agricultural techniques. And I know that DARPA has done some work on food security, even how to create, there's some technology about how to create food or protein from air and water, except, for remote field activities. I can see the name, this woman who's done the work, but I can't right at the moment recall her name, but she's very capable, Molly John, Jahn, Jahn. On the small modular nuclear reactors, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in nuclear today. Not just small and micro reactors, which could be, first, the military bases will serve as test beds and, first users, first adopters of some of this new technology. There's one slated for Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska set to open. There are many applications for remotely powering for remote bases. It could potentially be used, more broadly to power a civilian community. But there's also a lot of advances happening in nuclear fuel today to make it safer, so that the next generation fuel won't have those proliferation risks. So, and those worlds, one of the things I did in the State Department study I just referenced was try to better connect the worlds between the non-proliferation, the guardians of non-proliferation, which are extremely important, and the changes in nuclear technology. I think there's a lot more work that has to be done to educate both sides. The non-pro people got to understand nuclear energy technology, which has not usually been what they focused on, and the nuclear energy people have to understand the non-proliferation side. So I think there's a lot more coming in that area. It's very exciting, because the U.S. has lost its competitive edge in nuclear in the last couple of decades. China and Russia and others have really taken a march and competitively selling civilian nuclear energy technology, and we do so at our own peril. We forsake American leadership in this area. So I think that's also a very important area, and thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.